While we love reading and collecting comics, we recognize it can be a little bit difficult to get started. Here's everything you need to know about collecting comics in 2025. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Strong Collectors Comics. I'm your host Jordan, joined today by my plucky co-host Dakota. And as I said, comics, whether you're just getting started, whether you saw a movie and want to get going, can be a little bit hard to know where you're going, how to get started, and what things you want to be checking out. And I was thinking about this because recently, Dakota, I was with my wife at the comic store, and she was looking at all the Batman books. She hasn't read a ton of Batman comics, but she's like, if I was reading Batman, what do I even start with? Because, you know, you got the old stuff, you got the new stuff, you got the walls full of comics, which I think maybe as comic fans ourselves, we maybe don't realize how that could be incredibly confusing, like what the heck is going on here. Mm-hmm. So I've got some ideas, and Dakota and I have had many conversations on this process here, but one of the first things that I thought of as being helpful, if you are just starting out in comics, is to realize and understand what comics are. Now, this might sound a bit basic, but I think it's important because comics are pretty unique in being a long-form style of storytelling, right? You might have Batman comics way back in the 30s, but it's not necessarily like Batman started in the 30s and it's a through line through all that, which, again, as comic fans, I think we accept that, we know that. To the outside viewer, it might be like, okay, this is just the continuous Batman because we've had different creators, you have different writers, you got different series over the years, and some of them are one-offs, some of them don't necessarily apply. But even comics that follow one story to another don't always line up, and sometimes there's changes and things like that. So I would say if you're getting into comics, viewing them very much as kind of an a la carte, choose your own what you want to read type thing. And there are some storylines that will connect and build. Usually that's if you have like a same creative team or they're specifically referencing back to something. But I wouldn't feel, as best you can, not feel too intimidated to try to find where you want to start and jump in and see how it feels and maybe go from there. But what do you think about all those concepts there, Dakota, as I pitch that idea?
Yeah, I think that's definitely important because it could definitely be intimidating, like not only just thinking like, okay, Batman started way back then, I've got to read all those issues to catch up to what comes out today.
Right.
But also, like you said, like whether it's Batman or I think of like X-Men, if like, because one of the groups we're possibly going to partner with is like they have like a flash drive that has every X-Men comic on it. But even to me as a comic book fan, I'm like, okay, but does that have like X-Men proper? Does that have one shots? Does that have annuals? Does that have Uncanny X-Men, all new X-Men, new X-Men? All those things, like those are all like offshoots of the same kind of team with, but they don't always tie into each other. So yeah, it is. It is not as big as it looks. It is there's a lot more bite-sized things within those big stories.
Yeah, I think that's a good point you make too. Even to read X-Men nowadays, you don't have to go back to X-Men #1 in 1963 or whatever and read every X-Men.
Right.
I mean, if you started there, you would be like, this is very different from what I know as the X-Men.
Yes.
I think those things can be cool when you find out what you want, but you could pretty well find like an X-Men story that doesn't require you to read 300 issues to get caught up, just because, yeah, the stories have changed so much and new writers have taken over and there's new directions you go to.
And even like within that, like for myself, I was wanting to read like a specific X-Men story, House and Powers of X. So I was like, okay, I should go back and read the stories that came before this so that I kind of get that build in. So I went back and I read it, and it was just a hard cut new story. So I did all that extra reading that really did not matter at all coming up to the story I actually wanted to read. So if I just started with the story I wanted to read, that was the start of the book, and then I could go on from there.
Okay.
So sometimes going back doesn't actually help. I mean, they were still good books. I'm glad I read them, but it didn't tie in.
And I think that brings up another good point, which is research, right? So if we want to realize and we know what comics are, we kind of get the idea, but the next part I think would be looking things up. I mean, that could be reading up. There's definitely cool articles people write. There's videos, such as this. Thanks for watching. But other things you could see if you're like, I want to know about this character, or I heard about this storyline, or even like going on Reddit, like what are the best X-Men stories or the best Batman stories. I think things like that are super helpful to give you some guides of like, these are considered maybe the iconic stories, or maybe you hear about one that isn't iconic, but you're like, oh, that sounds interesting. and I'd like to find that. Because it is hard when you just walk into a store. You don't know, if you don't know any of these storylines, to just pick one out. So you could ask your local nerd for sure, also at the comic store. Always great for that kind of thing. But just doing research, and I think that being okay, even if you're watching something like, what's the basics I need to know about comic book Moon Knight? Or, I think there's all kinds of things like that that give you a bit of a framework, and then you can maybe pick which storylines you want to be following specifically.
Yeah, and I use stuff like reading guides all the time, especially because like if I want to read like bigger chunks of story, like when I want to go through the Ultimate Universe, like I want to kind of read them in not necessarily the order they come out, but kind of the order of the story. So like sometimes you'll go from Spider-Man books to X-Men books to Fantastic Four books, and they're not necessarily like required reading, but I want to read like everything within that universe. So I kind of want those woven together how they're supposed to be. So I just always have a tab open on my phone of like the reading guides of those specific stories that I'm reading.
Yeah. And I think kind of using those resources are very helpful. And if you wanted to see an explanation of comic book terminology, we did talk about that. So going along with comic book guides and all that stuff, you can go back and check those out. So that could really give you an idea of maybe which directions you want to go in. I think once you start reading comics, this is an important thing too, I'd say, is persistence and realizing you don't have to like every comic you read. Now, Dakota and I think, have read a decent amount of comic books. And even for me, I love Spider-Man. There's some Spider-Man comics I love. There's some Spider-Man comics I haven't liked at all. There's some writers that I've really liked what he wrote on this, he or she, and then I read something else they did, and I'm like, I don't like this one. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, or you're like, I don't want to read about this character, I don't want to read from this creator anymore. But I do think there's just different styles of storytelling, and sometimes those work, sometimes those don't. But I think when you find a comic you really like, then that stands out. But I would say don't feel like if you try one and it doesn't work, comics aren't for you, or whatever that might mean.
No, that's a very interesting point, because as you say that, like I'm thinking one of my favorite writers of all time is Brian Michael Bendis, but also there are stories that he's written that just kind of annoy me with how wordy he gets sometimes. But also there's times where I'm reading stuff and I'm like, dang, who wrote this? Because this is awesome, and it's him. There's also like stories like there's a World War Hulk that's like one of my favorite big events of all time. The artist on that is one of my least favorite of all time. So there's those crosses where sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the things that don't work do work, and you give it a chance.
Yeah, and I think with that too, that's a good idea about like finding an artist or creator you like. I think that can be fun. It's like, I want to read their stuff or see this kind of art. I think that can give you something like an idea of things you want to be looking for. And even beyond just reading comics, I do think it's important too to give yourself, like, I don't know, maybe space for learning how to read comics. Not to say that like you can't just pick up a comic and read it, but it is a different form of storytelling. Some people, I remember even as a kid, it'd be like, where are these bubbles going, or how do I follow this stuff? I think
I still
that
get confused
can be,
by that sometimes.
Well, yeah. Well, it can still happen, but I do remember even at that point being like, what way is this going? So I think giving yourself patience for that too, if you're like, I don't totally get how this form right away, but I think the more you read that, you can get the hang of it and then start to appreciate when artists or creators are doing like different things with the medium. But I think that maybe is something, again, as well-versed comic readers, we might not realize that it's not the same as just picking up like a book and reading it. There is another element to it. But once you've got that, right, you've done your research, you know some books you want to read, maybe you've been dabbling in reading some books. One thing I think you should be doing as well is using resources to get comics, because comics can be a little expensive, right, Dakota? We know that. So I always recommend checking out your local libraries. That's where I've read tons of comics. Usually they have, collected editions that you can check out and read. Maybe if you like it, you want to buy it, or you want to read more. There's comic reading apps. We've used Marvel Unlimited a good amount, where they have like a digital database. I'm sure you've read a lot of comics there, Dakota, that you would have spent quite a bit of money to read otherwise.
Yeah. I mean, we did an episode of, I think I read 600 comics last year or something like that, and most of those were online. And yeah, I didn't crunch the numbers, but I mean, you take 600 times $3, $4,
Four.
$5,
Yeah.
$7 sometimes. That's a lot of money if I was going to the local comic book store, which like I still want to give my local comic book store money, but I don't have that much money to give, unfortunately.
Unfortunately not at this point yet, but maybe we'll get there. So yeah, using things like that, even borrowing from friends, buying collected editions. There's the whole buying a single issue versus a collected edition. I think usually a collection is cheaper and you can find sales on those. So just kind of doing things like that. So I would say you don't get burnt out on like this is either really expensive or hard to manage. And I'd say going with that idea, don't feel like you have to buy or follow everything. Because again, you walk into the comic store, there's at any given time at least 100, maybe more titles right there on the wall.
Yeah.
And those can be expensive, right? But I say it's okay to be selective of like which ones you want to read. Because I usually, it's like if I'm picking it up weekly or monthly, whatever it is, I want to make sure it's one I really, really want to read, because I have had that before where I've almost gotten too many series, and then I'm like, this is almost too much to keep track of.
Right.
So I'd say that's okay to take that approach and kind of using that along with maybe some of the other comic resources that we've been talking about to make sure you can still be reading them, but you're reading the ones you want to read or aren't getting your wallet completely drained by the comics. Those are some thoughts on getting started reading comic books. Let us know if you'd like to hear us elaborate on any of those topics. There's no shortage. We could keep on going with those. If you want to check out some of our other videos, feel free to do that. In the meantime, please be liking, sharing, and subscribing. And until next time, as always, stay strong.